just realizing like, oh, we're doing this thing together, and we're in this together, and like we're excited to figure it out together.
That was really refreshing to be in a situation where I didn't feel like I had to pretend like I had all the answers.
There was a sense of like childlike play. Did we all just become best friends?
Hi, friends. Welcome to another Dreams of Education podcast with me, Kelly Tankley, and my friend and coworker,
Michelle Baldwin.
So last week we said that we were going to do kind of a dive into inquiry and why we chose to be inquiry-based, but I wanted to take it back, and we've mentioned this before, but one of the reasons why Anastasis even exists is because when I was teaching in curriculum heavy school, when I was teaching in the technology classroom where I was free of curriculum, but then as a tech integration specialist was helping teachers kind of utilize the boxed curriculum that they got, I just became so disenfranchised with this one-size-fits-all boxed curriculum that was so static. It didn't know the students. It was very one-dimensional. It just didn't see kids, and that makes sense. We can't really expect a standardized curriculum to see the complexity of lives in our classroom. And so that led me to when I was working with a lot of different area schools as a consultant and seeing, oh, it's not just the school I was in, like all of us are using curriculum from the same big six publishers. It's all one-dimensional. It's not meeting the needs of kids well. And that really got me thinking, like, how could we truly see individuals in our care and make it more dynamic for the actual students showing up? And that led to me thinking about a piece of technology being the Learning Genome Project that might help enable that to be true. But in that process of me kind of falling very out of love with curriculum, the one-size-fits-all version, I was doing that blog alliance. I was connecting, as we said, with teachers all around the world, and two of them that really stand out in my mind as so inspirational, and they really are those who had me thinking in different ways about what learning even is Edna Saxon and Maggie Mahasgrain. And they were both in inquiry-based IB schools and sharing their journey. And it was just this light bulb of like, oh, well, of course, that's the way it should be. It's completely dynamic. It's contextual. It's brilliant. But wanted to talk about what it's like to be actually in an inquiry-based school, where I started an inquiry-based school having never actually taught in an inquiry-based school. And I know that that's not really your background either. And we literally started, when we say we had no curriculum, we literally started with zero. We had nothing. So I wanted to talk about what was that like being a teacher coming into this space with literally starting at zero. There was nothing to kind of fall back on, no textbooks, no curriculum.
For me, it wasn't a huge leap at first, because I'd been teaching music, and fortunately for me, the experiences that I had were not so tightly tied to the written curriculum. When I taught junior high and high school, I wrote all the curriculum.
Yeah,
so
that was tech,
right?
Didn't have a curriculum either, so I had that same freedom in my own classroom.
That was in the early 90s, and it was, not only did they not have curriculum for me, they didn't have standards either. So I was, like first year teacher coming up with everything. And of course I can look back and go, okay, there were lots of mistakes made, but I also can look back and go, I did a whole lot as a very young teacher, creating what I thought would be good scope and sequence for those classes. When I was in a classroom that did have standards, for the elementary music, they still didn't have, there were no pacing guides like there were for the English and science and math and social studies teachers. So there still was a little bit of freedom. So I think just that background for me made it a little bit easier than maybe it did for others. I know that I came in excited about it because I have a lot of passions and interests in, many different types of content areas. So it was exciting to be able to do that. When it came down to, okay, we really don't have any resources. We're starting from ground zero and moving up.
Yeah.
That could be a little bit intimidating, especially if you are a teacher who likes to have things laid out for you. For me, I'm not a super adventurous person until it comes to learning. And that for me was very empowering. I loved it. I know that not all of our colleagues always felt the same. So I can see how that could be super like, oh gosh, I don't have a textbook. What do you want me to teach? So then it comes back down to breaking it down.
It was immediately jumping into the deep end for sure. The way that we started, and a lot of that was intentional. It was what happens if we truly start with students and there's nothing to fall back on. Because what I was afraid of is that if we had a curriculum to fall back on, we'd end up just doing the same thing everybody, when we got stressed, when we were, whatever that might look like, we would just fall back and do the same thing that everybody else was doing. And we knew we did not want to be or do that. Like there was no reason for us to start a school and then end up kind of in the same place.
Well, we had learning standards, but there weren't like, you didn't have to have an objective every day or every week. It was, how are we going to move these kids through to get, through this umbrella idea of the standard, whether it be in math or in reading or some topical area that we were going into that might've combined science and art. And that again was something that I was really grateful for, because I love when we see the intersectionality of how you can't just say math exists in a silo and science exists in a silo and art. They all have these, common pieces. And it was so fun to be able to show kids and help them discover those things.
And it gives it all so much context. You're not learning kind of all these things in silos. You're seeing how it is all connected. And we always joke, because you're so good at giving math context beyond math. And for so many of us who math was a siloed subject our entire lives, there was never really overlap. Maybe in physics or chemistry, you'd get some overlap, but there was never real overlap where you were seeing the development of ideas, the development of how we understand mathematical concepts and these different pieces. And so you're so good at math specifically, you're good at all of it, but math specifically was an area where I feel like everybody kind of relied on you to be like, help us understand and give context to why we are learning XYZ.
Oh, thanks.
Sometimes literally XYZ.
Well, but like Nancy would bring in like, she would talk a lot too about how we're going to go out and we're going to look at a tree, and she'd have the kids sketch the tree. And then they'd start to see how the tree was branching out literally. And then she'd start talking about fractals and Fibonacci. And then the kids started to see, right? So it wasn't just me. Yeah.
It for sure wasn't. I think, I think what made us so unique as a staff is Nancy, I think, knew fractals, but Fibonacci, she's like, I think there's a pattern here. I think there's a mathematical, but she literally would say to her students, like, I think there's a mathematical pattern here that we could explore. And then they all learned it together. I think inquiry requires a certain level of vulnerability and humility that comes with it. And that can be hard to do in a system where we've been conditioned that not only hustle culture, that learning has to happen on like, a certain schedule, but also teachers are the ones who are supposed to be the experts, who are supposed to know, who are, and so we've been so conditioned, I think, by our own schooling that it can be really hard to enter into that humility and vulnerability with 7-year-olds.
That's so funny that you bring that up, because I have a blog post in draft form right now talking about how with learning, I think the fact that we took on that word teacher as in somebody that has to be the expert in showing the way, rather than I'm an expert in learning. and I'm going to help you learn as you go along. And I'm going to show you things that help you as a learner rather than always being the expert in content. And that's not to say that we don't need experts in content. We absolutely do. But if you're not a teacher / learner first, a lot of the beauty in learning kind of gets pushed aside for the content itself. And that's where
and the content ends up so, like we said, decontextualized. It doesn't have any meaning when you're learning it in isolation. It's those teachers who are so passionate about it that can like sweep you up in it. But they're also, like you said, they're the ones who are gifted learners and gifted at nurturing learning in others.
Right.
So they are typically the ones who are helping you make those connections, giving it context, giving you a reason to care about it. But unfortunately, that's just not the case in so many classrooms.
Right. Well, and you also think too, like the labels that learners have often placed upon themselves or someone else did of, well, I'm just bad at math, or I'm not a good reader, or, social studies or history isn't my thing. That's okay. You don't have to be good at everything, but if I'm really good at my job as helping you learn, then I'm going to help you to see why there's context, why we need to learn some of the things that we do. What parts do we focus on to help us get more understanding rather than I'm just memorizing a bunch of dates or algorithms or whatever it happens to be.
Well, and what I learned as a learner myself, who I love to learn, I love to read, I love to all of it. In school, history was not my thing. And I don't know if it was, I just had history teachers that didn't bring it to life for me. But it wasn't until, watching the History Channel or something that I realized like, oh, these are people's lives and stories. And it's super, right? That's interesting to me. Unfortunately, when I was in school, that wasn't the way it was presented to me. But by being a learner, it doesn't matter when I meet the content,
right?
Because I know how to meet it. And I think that we don't focus enough on that skill of learning. We think it has to happen in the timetable of, kindergarten through 12th grade or whatever it is, that you have to learn this content now or it's a lost cause. And I think that is a little bit of a disservice, that if we're teaching kids, one, in context, we're teaching them how to be learners. We trust that no matter when they meet the learning, they're going to be able to engage it because they have the underlying skills to do that.
Right. Just as you were saying that, I was thinking about a session I went to. It was at EduCon. I don't remember which year, but Diana Laufenberg and Zach Chase they were leading it, and they were talking specifically about history and social studies. And I remember saying in that session, I feel sorry for the kids who are going to school now, because if you're in a school where you are learning history and social studies chronologically, you have more than I had to learn when I was a kid 30, 40 years ago, whatever. And how do you do that? You start losing pieces of even if it's just American history, that's a lot. And we were talking about that in that session, and Diana and Zach were speaking specifically to, we need to be teaching thematically. And so if we're looking at something like revolution, I know you brought that up in our previous discussion, but if we're just thinking about how revolution starts, I don't need to go back and only talk about revolution when it fits that part of the timeline. Rather, I can look across the globe and say, okay, well, revolution in Haiti and revolution in France and revolution in the United States and colonization. I mean, all of those themes we can tie those things together, and we can start looking at root causes and what was going on in the culture and society at the time, and how much more important that context is than remembering the exact dates and locations of battles or whatever it happens to be.
Yes, that's how I learned history, was based on, you memorize the dates, you memorize the battles, who won what part. I was never really led through that process thematically of understanding like what creates the conditions for a revolution.
Right.
And so we were really intentional about that. I remember the Egyptian revolution, the Twitter revolution that was going on during, and I can't even tell you which years of Anastasis that was, but I remember putting in revolution into the inquiry blocks because I wanted the kids in that moment that it was happening live to be able to go back and explore how other revolutions have looked, and what kind of common things create, like I said, the conditions for revolutions, and then how do they play out even as technology changes, as the world looks a little different. It was such a cool inquiry block to see the kids go through that process and really connect with what was happening in the world right now, but also see the trends throughout time, and kind of dive into those different moments of time. Was such a neat experience as somebody who went through history class just learning names, dates,
Right.
locations, battles.
I know that I sent a couple of those classes to a museum as I was helping to coordinate learning trips or field trips outside of the building. And there was one of the museums in Denver where they had an entire exhibit of art in that came from Revolution. And so the kids got to go in and see that too. And they came back and they were so excited and talking about it. And, just even in having a conversation at recess with one of the kids, what did you learn about Revolution just from looking at the art pieces? And they were just overflowing with all of the things that they had learned and connections that they made in ways that were so different than if they had just read it on the internet or in a textbook or, whatever the traditional model might have been. So being able to give kids this, this variety of very rich experiences because of how we do inquiry. And it always comes back down to, what are the questions that we are asking ourselves? What resources do we think that we could help find some answers? But then the best part about inquiry yet is then, what questions do we have now? It's not just answer the question and you're done. It's like it just keeps spiraling. And I know that for some people, they'll talk about intellectual meandering. And yeah, you can get stuck there. But I also think that maybe when you're looking at a class of students, regardless of the age, and they're kind of all branching out in different areas. And I know, like we've used bunny trails as a metaphor for we're kind of getting off the beaten path. But when they start to see that here's our main topic, and look at all of the different offshoots that you're all interested in, and then as the lead learner, I have to come back and say, okay, how is this all connected? Yeah, you're way over here thinking about this art piece that you saw. How does that connect to this article that this person just found in an old newspaper? And then having them talk through it, and using Socratic seminar circles or however we chose to do it. You can tell me I'm getting excited talking about it, but that's where that passion and learning is so important.
I think the idea of intellectual meandering assumes that there's something wasted in that.
Right. And there's
to me, there's nothing wasted.
Right.
It all ends up coming back, and again, we're helping make meaning, right? We're there along as guides to help make meaning and help make those connections. And sometimes it doesn't happen even right away. I mean, I remember a kiddo who they were learning about space. He was really interested in black holes when he was, 9, 10 age. And then when he was in the junior high class, they were reading as a class, they were going through A Wrinkle in Time. And he's the only one that understood, oh, this is like, he was the only one who could make that connection. It was years later, right? As they were kind of analyzing this text and doing a deep dive. So I think, we can look, learning is not efficient all the time.
No, it can't be.
In fact, it can be very inefficient. And none of it is wasted, because years later, they'll come back and see a connection that I couldn't have planned that moment.
That's where I think as a teacher, if you're teaching in an inquiry style, that you cannot be the expert on everything, because then you're really the one not designing the learning, but driving the learning. And it really has to be the students who are driving the learning. So as a teacher, I know that we've often said in education circles, don't be the sage on the stage, be the guide on the side. What does it look like to be a guide on the side? And that was something that I experienced a whole lot more teaching at Anastasis, really, than anywhere else. And it is that let the kids drive the learning. You're helping them to make connections in ways. And then when you see them starting to branch out, how do you bring it all back? How do you help them see connections? Some kids will very naturally see patterns in connections as well. Mm-hmm. Others need a little bit more help. So again, by me asking more questions, instead of saying, mm-hmm. oh, see, it's right there, because that takes that whole process of discovery away from the learner. If I'm just saying, oh, here it is, I'm giving you this little piece of paper with all of the answers on it, that's not going to make meaning for that child.
Well, the seeking system is really activated, the seeking system in the brain, by inquiry. Mm-hmm. And what we know is that when the seeking system is activated, it's what it creates the right conditions for creativity, innovation, connections. And it really comes back to that's how learning happens. Right. And so what we're doing in school, I think, is sometimes artificial in the way that we're trying to get learning to happen. It can be very surface level. And I think that leaves kids like me feeling like frauds when you get to the end, because I could check the boxes, I could take the test in history and get the A, but it was like I cleared the cache as soon as the test was done because I had nothing to connect it to. I had no reason for it. And so I think not giving kids the ability to understand that things are connected, that there's context, that they can, make connections. It was always so fun to even see the kids start to make connections with each other mm-hmm. Across the learning, because of they got used to that, right? It wasn't even always us who was having to make the meaning. The kids ended up doing a lot of the meaning making in the end, after they got in and learned how to do inquiry, how to be learners. They were equally as involved in that process as we were.
Right. Well, and that I think goes back to the different types of inquiry that we would do as teachers. If I had a mm-hmm. class of very young students or some older students who maybe were new to the school or had, gone through different years at Anastasis, the whole idea of inquiry learning can be very overwhelming for the kids too. So starting mm-hmm. off with just showing them, very, very guided and structured inquiry, where I would start off with the questions. Here are some questions. What other questions do we have? And if they weren't able to generate those yet, because it's surprisingly difficult to learn how to ask really good questions. I even have a poster that I can see.
Well, even how to open and close questions, right? Yep. How to make them more broad versus yes, no answers.
I have a poster hanging in my office right now that I can see that has 4 different levels of questions. And the very basic ones are still the who, what, where, when. And then you start getting into deeper levels. And okay, well, why did this happen? Or mm-hmm. How did you feel about when this happened? And that's still how we make our own personal connections to things. That's still part of inquiry as well. Mm-hmm. It doesn't seem like that's always a question that you get, you're not evaluating things at every level of learning. So how do you structure that as a teacher when you have a class full of beginners? You have to mm-hmm. teach them how to ask good questions, what the inquiry process might look like. I visited a school in Canada, in Alberta once, Calgary Science School. It's not called that anymore, but they were a very structured inquiry-based school, and they mm-hmm. had there was a system that they put in place so that you had, these are your steps for inquiries. It was very, very guided, very structured. And as the kids, as you got into the school and we were talking with the older kids, their projects were more open inquiry, where they were the ones designing and leading it all, and the teachers were back to help with resources. So as we were looking at Anastasis and thinking, okay, how are we going to do this? That's kind of how we would kind of move kids up as they got older. They had more freedom to really do more of the design. Yeah. As well as, where is this going to go? What are you going to learn from it? And how are we here to help you?
It was always hard too, because we would enroll kids for the first time as an 8th grader. And so they haven't been through all of that process. It was always really interesting. You could tell as an outsider who had started at Anastasis mm-hmm. and learned that process all the way through versus who's just getting into the process. Anytime I led through educators, they could instantly oh, that kid's newer to this.
Mm-hmm.
It was very obvious that scaffolding of how to be a learner, how to ask good questions, how to engage inquiry, it really does matter as a holistic view. It does make a difference. And two, by the time they're, eighth graders with us, if they're a new eighth grader with us, they've had 7 other years of more traditional education somewhere else where they've learned habits about what learning looks like. And so some of that has to be undone as
Right.
you're kind of rebuilding.
Well, and I think that still comes back down to knowing your students. And we talked about this in the last episode about how important it is to build relationships with the kids and trust. So maybe I do have a class full of junior high kids, and the particular inquiry block that we're in might be really, really exciting and super easy for some kids to just jump in with both feet. And for others, even if they've been with us for a long time, this might be where they have some hesitation. We saw that a lot in how we express ourselves, which we tended to be more on the art side. And some kids were like, nope, I'm not artsy
That's
at
not
all,
me.
right? And so just even knowing your students well enough to say, okay, these 3 over here, they're going to go open inquiry all the way. This group over here really needs me more along the way with them because they need that guidance to help them trust themselves, to trust what they're learning, and just to have that, like, that fallback of somebody else is here if I'm not sure where I'm going yet. And if you don't know your students well enough, or like we'd said earlier, if it's a one size fit all, you're putting them all on the same track and you're setting kids up to fail. And I know that I was thinking about, I know I've talked to you about this before. I had a friend who at the beginning of the school year, before school had even started, posted something about how excited she was that she had her lesson plans done for the entire school year. And I wasn't trying to be a jerk, I swear. But I had messaged her and said, how do you have that done when you haven't even met your kids yet? And she goes, well, this is just what, our curriculum and our pacing guides has set for me. So this is where I have to be. And I was like, oh, I see. And I felt really badly for her. And I felt really badly for the kids, because if you're on a schedule, a timetable of learning, if you don't understand something and your timetable is up for that particular topic, too bad, we're on to the next thing.
Moving on.
And how, that's just not great for kids' sense of self. You get those kids who think, well, I'm just dumb, I don't get things, when they just really need more time. And I feel like inquiry helps that so much.
There's just no room for humanity in that kind of classroom, right? You're expecting that you're working with like I said, a static one-dimensional thing. And what we know is that's just not the case when you work with humans and kids. And in a world, like I said, that's constantly moving, that's dynamic, that's changing all the time. I was also thinking about how important it is that all of us as staff were inquirers ourselves, and that we were interested in being curious and asking questions and kind of deep diving into areas of passion, and how much that shaped what would end up happening in the classroom was our own inquiry, and our own curiosity would often intersect in cool ways that, again, we couldn't necessarily have predicted. But once we saw how it was intersecting, it like just came to life and blossomed in such incredible ways that what we were doing outside of school, suddenly the whole world is coming into the school, and things are changing. I was thinking specifically of when the kids were doing, I think they were just doing a poetry unit in the junior high, and you were like, oh my gosh, I just saw this incredible TED Talk with Amal the poet. She's a spoken word poet. I wonder, she lives in Colorado. I wonder. And that was a moment that happened in a staff meeting where we're just kind of chit-chatting, and led to one of my favorite experiences at Anastasis, having Amal come in, do a spoken word for our kids. Even that dynamic was super interesting, us being a more Christian-based school, but here we have this Muslim woman coming in and sharing. It was just the most incredible experience. And then she partnered with some of our junior high and came back several times and just taught them how to do spoken word, came back for their performance of the spoken word that they made. I mean, it was just the coolest experience. But it really started with, here's kind of what we're doing in the classroom, and then you having this outside experience that you're like, what we could do.
Well, and I think that lends to the flexibility of not having timetables set in stone, right? Mm-hmm. And also the possibility of, oh, sure, let's bring her in if she'll come, right? It didn't have to go through this whole bureaucratic system of, well, we have to sign her off and blah, blah, blah. I think there are a lot of teachers who are in traditional systems that don't have flexibility, who are doing amazing things with teachable moments when they can and when they're allowed to. And I think that's important to make sure that we honor that as well. It was just a situation for us where we could do that almost any time. So if we had a meeting on a Wednesday morning with the staff and something came up, enough of us could pivot then and say, oh, let's add that in. Let's see how that fits into with what our kids are doing. And again,
and let's bring her in for the whole community
right.
to hear her. And then she can go with the junior high that's working on this very specific thing. But then, even the way the rest of the community ended up finding ties into what she shared that morning with everybody was, I don't know, it was incredible.
I think that for us, it kind of, after a few years, it became, this is just how we do things. And we kind of forgot that that's not how it happens.
I think we forgot.
Schools.
I do think we forgot, because I'd tell these stories and people would look at me with these blank expressions like, what are you on about? Like, how does that even work? And it was just so much of our norm that, we stopped seeing it all the time. It just became part of our background.
Our good friend, Christina Ishmael, calling us the unicorn school all the time, right?
Yes.
And we would go to conferences together and I'd start to say something about, grading or homework or whatever. And she would just gently put her hand on me like, you're a unicorn. I'm like, oh yeah. I have to remember
this isn't everybody's reality.
Yeah. So I could, kind of go off on, why are you assigning so much homework in a traditional model, or do you have to do that? And for some, the answer is, we're required to. And, I could get all up in my high and mighty, but you shouldn't do that when that's not everyone else's reality. So it has been over the last 14 years, a good practice in humility, which sometimes is hard, but to also say, this isn't everybody else's reality. So what is it that we can suggest to people who are in a system that can't do the things that we do on a regular basis? Well, what could you do that's small? Where could you start? And sometimes that is releasing the control in the classroom to the students, making it more student-centric, and having them kind of take if it's a specific topic that you have a little freedom with, let them kind of take it first. Where are they going to go with it? And it doesn't have to be you. Okay, we're starting a new unit. I'm going to stand up here and lecture for the first half an hour, and then you're going to read the textbooks for the next half an hour, or whatever it might be. But I feel like that's a generalization. I know a lot of teachers don't do that. I don't want a bunch of comments saying, oh, they think we're awful. That's not the case at all. But I'm wondering, how can you find places for that?
Yeah. And me and my sparkly unicorn optimism, and like, we're going to transform every school so that it can do this, because we're going to tell our stories so well that everyone will be convinced that this is the way that we can do things if we just think a little differently. And that's my hope. I know that not everybody is there yet, but you're right. There are things that there's changes and pivots that can happen in any classroom that will make it more learner focused. Right. And even more inquiry based, even within a scripted curriculum. There are things that you can do that are very inquiry driven. So let's maybe talk about what that looks like. I know you touched on, we say we started with nothing. We didn't have any purchased Fox curriculum. It's not entirely true, because we still did use standards.
Right.
I rewrote the Common Core standards, meaning I tweaked them to be more student statements. as well as taking away any of the guardrails of grade levels. So it was just one big continuum. And then we also used next generation science standards, which were brilliantly already written as inquiry topics, and Colorado State social studies standards. And so we had that as a basis. And then I created inquiry guides based on, I love the International Baccalaureate's PYP questions. They're the most brilliant questions in my mind, because everything in the world, I have yet to find a topic or an idea that doesn't fit in one of those inquiry blocks. And so we kind of use that as our basis. And then what I would do is align the lines of inquiry for each age level. So primary, intermediate, junior high. I'd create a question where I was taking into consideration what standards exist in this band that we need to hit. And we may not hit every single standard for every grade every year, but within a 2-year period, you've hit everything, within that. So there was that thinking behind it. But as far as, resources and all of those pieces, that was really where we were coming together as a staff. And, oh, have you read this book? Have you thought about this? Or I just saw this great video. Maybe you could, that's where we were working together to really resource the inquiry. But it all started from this very humble place of some idea of where we were going.
I think it goes back to, all right, I'm not the expert in every single thing. I am a very curious individual. I love learning new things. And that first year I was new to Colorado, and the students that I had were mostly third and fourth graders, so a couple of fifth. Again, because they were all in the same room, I knew that fourth grade in Colorado said, okay, you need to learn more about Colorado history and geography. And so I was talking with the kids. I was like, I don't know anything about Colorado other than places I visited before.
We'll learn it all together.
Look at all these cool things that we can learn together. And they then got excited because they were going to be teaching me something. So just kind of taking that as the hook, they got really excited. Oh, Mrs. Baldwin doesn't know this, so we're going to make sure she learns it. So they were learning. We would use a lot of internet resources. We used books in the library. We talked about, how do we know if this is factual? How do we know, is it outdated information? Is it relevant, meaningful, et cetera? And putting all of those things into place was my job. But they were the ones that really did all the discovery. So by the time we got through that particular inquiry unit, they taught me about the gold and silver rush in Colorado and all the mining towns and the Molly Brown house. And we talked about, Molly Brown was on the Titanic, but her name isn't really Molly. Somehow that became her name over time. It was so fascinating, and they did such a great job. That's just one tiny little thing that we did. And that was where they were able to see, my teacher doesn't have to know everything about this, but she's going to help us learn the things that are important about how to find that information, how to gather it, and then what do we do with it. And that's where I think inquiry as a teacher is exciting, because you get to learn some new things. You don't have to already have everything in place knowledge-wise or fact-wise as the teacher.
Yeah, I mean, it was so clear even in that example you gave of Nancy's class. The inquiry block was about patterns, seeing patterns in nature. It was all patterns based. And so that was really what led to them. They found this giant sunflower in our garden, and they were noticing the spiral in the seeds in the center. And that's where Nancy said, I think there's some math that explains why that spiral exists. And so they watched a couple YouTube videos. It was her figuring it out with them and learning with them. And then once they figured out how the Fibonacci sequence works, they were all in to explain it to anyone who walked in the room. They were so excited at this, phenomenon in nature, and that they could do it mathematically because it's addition. But you think about where that would have fallen in a standards set, it would have never been in an elementary 6, 7, 8-year-old classroom. It would be, maybe high school, you learn Fibonacci sequence, but they were so excited and ready for it because, again, it had context for what they were learning and doing and excited about right then. And then they couldn't quite let it go. So as we moved into the how we express ourselves block, and they were like, we should make Fibonacci. We were also very into Leonardo da Vinci that year. So they wanted to make Fibonacci dots that showed Fibonacci patterns. And it was neat to see some kids even relate the Fibonacci sequence with, what if we did that with color? So each color is an additive. So even just seeing how the connections they were making and how it was kind of unfolding in their minds, that again, when I was writing that line of inquiry, it didn't occur to me to put that in. Now it does, right? Because
Well,
we all learn together.
That shows too how inquiry can be a natural differentiator, because for those kids, they were learning, some of them were just learning the sequence, and that's adding and looking at the number previous. But then as we worked with that with older kids, we started to look at the golden ratio, which is part of the Fibonacci spiral. And you look at, oh, there is a mathematical formula here. And how can we apply that? And then I think I had some older kids who were doing, they were looking at different rectangles. And then if you had 3 rectangles next to each other, how does that fit into the Fibonacci sequence? And what's the formula we can use to get there? And okay, now if I wanted to add another one, what would the area of that rectangle be? And they really got into it because it became like this mystery that they were solving. So we were a lot of times using, we're detectives and we're doing mysteries. And again, that's where you can take a math problem and look at it in an artistic way, but also there's a lot of history there. And so all of these things that just flow together, some of my kids maybe that year still needed to learn the sequence. They weren't ready for the division piece of that yet, or the decimal part of it. So that differentiator was, you're going to work on this part of it, while this other student over here is going to do more research on the golden ratio and what does that look like. So in a class full of kids who might have 3 years of difference between them, where some of them might have struggled or had some issues with, I still don't know how to add successfully yet, then they still had something that was topically related. They weren't doing completely isolated math problems because this person's considered in low math and this considered in high math. It didn't have to look like that.
I'm glad you brought that up. It's one of my very favorite parts about inquiry is it so naturally differentiates. Kids can push in, and the other thing I love is kids who would traditionally be considered low. The story I told about the black hole and the wrinkle in time, and he was the only one who made the connection. He also happened to be severely dyslexic and never felt successful in reading groups in that setting. And for him to be able to connect it with an inquiry that he had done and explain it to and kind of bring everybody in. I wish that I had it on film, because when he was like, I wonder if, and then showed his thinking to the class in a kind of Socratic seminar discussion, the whole class, it was like their minds were blown. They all sat back and they were like, whoa, he did, I think he did it. And, you don't get those moments of elation and feeling like you can be the hero in the story when we're so, traditional curriculum, so deficit focused that we look at how to differentiate based on deficit, not based on, and I love the way that inquiry puts everybody on kind of level playing field for making those connections, for having the insights, for teaching each other and making connections. The idea of like collective intelligence in the classroom, where we're all smarter because we're having these discussions, we're figuring it out together, with all of our own worldviews and histories and, all the things, just collides in such cool ways in an inquiry classroom.
Well, and if you think to some of the traditional models that, like, as you said before, can be deficit focused, and how many kids who do struggle with some things and they're not on grade level, they're often pulled into remedial classes. So they might be losing out on a recess, or they might be losing out on a specials, and a special
or class time.
Right. And they're pulled to get them caught up, which again, that I don't know how you can always catch a person up if the learning isn't meaningful. Right. I'm trying to say this very diplomatically because I know that there are a lot of situations where we look at kids and say, oh gosh, they're in third grade and they're still not reading on a third grade level yet. And I'm like, okay, so that is going to affect every other class because you're reading in math, you're reading in science, you're reading in art. But if I pull that child away and only focus on reading, then what does that say to that kid? And how do I then catch them up in the other classes that they're now missing? And again, I know that's a generalization and it's not exactly what's happening in every school. But that gives a message to that child that there's something wrong with you. And until I fix it, you can't do any of these other things. And
I think curriculum does something very similar. That one size fits all curriculum says, this is the most important.
Right.
Your questions don't matter as much as the ones we've curated for you. Your job is just the answers. What we're not thinking about is how voiceless that makes kids in their own learning.
Right.
And it's not intentional. I know it's not intentional. It's just it's the nature of a standardized curriculum. The nature is we don't have time for your questions. Your questions aren't as important as the ones we've decided to put here.
Yeah.
And so again, that inquiry based tells them your voice matters, your questions matter, your curiosity is important, how you're fitting together learning is important. We just don't think of those like unintended messages that get sent through a lot of what we're doing. And one of those being, you're behind. So we're going to pull you out. So I think that's important the way you said it. I can catch you up, right? It takes all the power away from the individual.
Yeah. I was thinking of a student that I had that, wasn't reading yet. And again, I wasn't concerned about that. And I know that he was, it felt very heavy to him, which you could see him kind of wear on his face when it was time to do any reading. But that was also a kid who is really, really good at engineering things and would build things all over the house and relatives' house and friends' houses. And so allowing that to flourish and giving that kid space to say, oh, hey, look what we did this weekend, and showing a video of, oh, I just built this all over my grandparents' house. And everybody in the whole class is like, whoa, how'd you do that? And now that kid became an expert and telling everybody in the class, well, here's how I did it. And we learned a lot about simple machines from that. I mean, again, there were so many things that we tied in. And then I was able to say, oh, there's a lot of math in that. Let's look at what you did and let's talk about the math involved. And so all of the kids got to look for the patterns in the math and like, oh, hey, I found this too. So we were able to take something that maybe would not have happened in a more traditional model because had to be on page 72 of the math book at that time, and pulled a math example out of that engineering that kid was glowing about because he was the expert. And I wonder if we made more time for that in all of learning, we aren't. The cynical part of me says we have school the way that we have school because we want to rank and sort and make sure that the kids who are really good stay really good and the kids who aren't stay really, really aren't really low. And that's not, that's a very cynical view. But that's kind of how the system has worked for a really long time.
It feels true.
It feels very true. And
it feels true.
That has been the greatest, at least for me as a teacher, the greatest thing about teaching and learning at Anastasis is watching kids who I know would have really struggled and probably have been, I'm the dumb kid, I'm the sad kid, I'm the troublemaker because none of this is working for me, right? All of the reasons that kids might not go the path that they could because of a system that doesn't work for them as an individual. And at Anastasis, we're able to look at them and say, I see who you are. I see how you learn. I see your strengths. And let's move forward with that.
Yeah. I was remembering another story of how an inquiry got started, like sparked. And it was right when I was reading Stephen Johnson's book, How We Got to Now. And I was talking about it with the teacher as the kids were coming in from recess. And I was like, you've got to read this. It's so good. It fits perfectly with how the world works, inquiry block. Like, it's just brilliant. You're going to love it. And I was explaining how it kind of unfolded in the book. And one of the kids was waiting to ask a question and was overhearing this conversation. And Deb was like, yeah, I think we should read it. It sounds really interesting, or I think I should read it. The kids that were standing there were like, I want to read it. And so they ended up reading Stephen Johnson's book, How We Got to Now, which was not age appropriate for that class. It's not, when I say it's not age appropriate, it was appropriate content. It just wasn't a book you typically would have paired with that age of student. And so they ended up reading it and just geeking out just as hard as I geeked out about it. And PBS at that time also came out with the video version. And so other classes were watching the videos at the same time. But it was so neat the way that he's so connective in his thinking. And as they were seeing the connections in innovations throughout history and how one thing leads to another, and also connects to all these other innovations that were happening throughout time, they got so geeked out about it. They created this amazing innovation museum where they took shipping container boxes, the flat rate boxes you can get at the post office for free. I'm sure they loved that I went in and took 80 of them. But we went and got those boxes, they painted them, and then they created a domino, like life-size dominoes, because they were talking about in one of the discussions how it was like the domino effect, that one thing led to another and kind of knocked down these other dominoes. And so then hearing their discussion, they each chose an innovation that they wanted to focus on, and they made the dominoes for that innovation. And then hearing their discussion as they're like, well, we have more information we want to share with whoever comes and sees our dominoes, but there's not enough space. So we'll have to make a website or a video or whatever, and then link to it with the QR code. But they set up this whole domino innovation museum out of these boxes in one of our big rooms. And then the whole school got to come, and everybody had been watching these videos, but then to come and honor their work that way, to see how they were thinking about it, and I wrote a blog post about it, and Stephen, tweeted about it, and Stephen Johnson saw it and was like, oh my gosh, let me talk to these kids. So it was so neat, this moment that started so innocuously with me having a conversation with a teacher about what I was reading and interested in and how I was making connections to the inquiry block, her being excited enough that when the kids came and said, oh my gosh, we want to read it. And then to allow that permission, yeah, let's all do it together. And the way that unfolded, and then to have the author, honor that work as well, was so neat. Just another, the way that inquiry works, it just sends out these strings everywhere, and you don't know exactly how they're all going to come back. We could redo that inquiry block 1,000 times and it'll never look like it did that year.
Well, and I think when I think back to written curriculum, boxed curriculum, one size fits all, a lot of it is the dependency on the textbook, because where are the kids going to get the information? And the internet is so scary, and there's so many things out there. And I think the way that we really approached it was, with my classes, I talked a lot about, we're going to learn about primary sources. We're going to learn about secondary sources. We're going to learn about, information and data triangulation. How important is it for us to know who's writing this? What's their bias? Is there a bias? There always is when we write something, right? And the kids got really good about, there are so many resources that we didn't just search Google, right? In fact, the first
Google is not a source.
It's not a source, right? And we would look at Wikipedia too and say, okay, well, if you look through Wikipedia, you can tell, if you go all the way to the bottom, you can see all of these sources that have been cited in the Wikipedia article. So let's go look at those. And quite a few of the things would be available online through different libraries. Library of Congress has so many resources that I don't think people even know that they can access for free. There were so many different places that we could do that. And then our learning trips that would be supplemental there, we would go and learn from experts. We were learning about paleontology and something at one point. So we went to a hotel, which sounds like a really ridiculous right? What are you going to...
I remember when Camille told me you were going to visit a hotel, and I'm like, what is she doing? How
Right?
is that connected to anything?
But the people who own the hotel, the Tallies, they had started they bought the hotel, and they have the entire thing is based on fossils, and they have a connection to the Morrison Museum of Natural History. And we got to visit there as well. So we have these actual paleontologists and people who have been producing movies about science and dinosaurs and interesting things. And the kids were listening to people that weren't their teacher. That wasn't just a book telling them something. So they were able to live through that. They got to see world-renowned paleontologists working on a fossil in that museum. And I'm like, do you guys realize how incredible this is? So now that goes back to finances in a school too, right? If I'm not busy,
I was just going to say that.
if I don't spend all my money on testing and textbooks, then I have the money to take my class to something that actually matches. It's not just a field trip. Oh, here's a field trip you go every year. You're in fourth grade. No, this field trip actually matched directly what we were doing.
Yeah, we touched on this, I think, in another episode, but we were working on the same per pupil expenditure as in the public school. What we did that was vastly different is we chose to dedicate our money to experiences and just-in-time materials rather than purchasing box curriculum, which is insanely expensive. And they somehow managed to get you to rebuy every 2 to 3 years. And it was like, no, if we say that we value students first, we value the learning experiences that that they're having. We want rich learning experiences for them. We have to have the dollars follow that. And
Right.
and our dollars are going to go towards rich experiences. It did help that we had class sizes of 12, makes them very mobile. We had a couple of 15 passenger vans, and so we could load them up in the vans and send them on their way. So that was helpful. A lot of the field trips we did, and probably the Tallies were one of them, didn't charge us because they weren't a typical field trip. It was not something that, it was us finding something random that we thought was interesting. And they're like, yeah, come bring the kids. That'd be amazing, and it's amazing how many community members are willing to, and experts are willing to invite kids in to share their passion and, connect in that way with community. And I think we learned that a little bit by accident, just the nature of how we were looking for things. And there's not always a field trip that like immediately pops into your mind and you're looking for what could the experience be. And so you start getting really creative and you end up at places like hotels where they're learning paleontology.
And the way that I found them was through an oatmeal comic.
Oh, no kidding.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I know that story.
They were helping to fund a Tesla memorial or museum or something that I don't even know if it came into fruition at all. But they were connected to that. And then the oatmeal comic drew something about dinosaurs. And I was like, hey, that's over in Morrison. I'm going to give them a call. But those are the kind of things that you can do, again, right?
We also have to be inquirers because we all had to be looking for connections in all of life, just as we were expecting kids to start seeing those connections. But it's amazing when you're in an inquiry-based school and you're around people who were thinking that way all the time. Like you said, it starts becoming very second nature and very natural to be like, oh, I found this thing, or I know this thing, or I read this, or I saw this. And suddenly like the entire world connects. We always found that no matter what inquiry block we were in, suddenly the entire world was all about that inquiry block. It's like when you buy a car and suddenly everybody's driving that car. You just learn to look at the world differently. I think that's true of us as teachers and staff. I also think it was true of the kids started seeing those connections.
Absolutely.
And I love when I would get things from parents too. Parents would like send me a DM on Facebook and be like, oh my gosh, did you see this? The kids were talking about they're doing so-and-so in inquiry. And did you see that this is coming to town? And so it was like the whole community got in on it as time went on. It certainly didn't start that way, I don't think. I don't remember it being quite so that way in the very early days.
I don't either. And I think that's, like you'd said before, it's kind of like a muscle that started to grow as you dive more deeply into questioning and looking for patterns and connections, you do start to see them more. And that I feel like that's when, again, because I didn't know much of Colorado, I didn't know what was available to us. So I really relied at the time on Camille or Kim or a parent saying, oh yeah, we've got one of those here in Denver. We also relied a lot on Skype in the early days, and then later on more like FaceTime and other video chats with authors.
Honestly, also Twitter, just asking, does anybody know of
and the Skype a scientist. I've had my students talk to people on multiple continents because we had a connection to someone who said, oh yeah, I've got somebody who lives in Brazil, and they can start talking about something that you're studying right now. Or like you said before Twitter kind of went downhill, we had so many contacts and like second and third level connections to people. I had, a gentleman from South Africa talk to my students one day, and we were just asking questions. And then after we got done, they're like, the kids thought I just knew everybody on the planet. Well, you have friends in...
It sure feels like that.
It does, right?
Michelle.
You know people in Africa, you know people in Europe. And it's like, I don't really know everyone, but I'm connected in a way because we have tools that allow us to connect in more meaningful ways than just, oh yeah, we tell each other what we had for lunch today.
Yeah. It was interesting. I think we had people who were excited to make those connections and excited just in their own worlds to do that. There were years that we had teachers that were less good at that, that struggled a little bit more with just thinking in those grooves. And so really relying on those of us who naturally did it, because as we brought in new staff, who didn't start with us and experience that process altogether. It didn't take long though before everybody was jumping, even as you onboarded kind of new staff in that way, it didn't take long for them to start seeing the world in that way.
I think you helped as administration the staff could be like vulnerable and say, I don't really know what to do with this. Help me out. And that's not an easy thing to be able to do, especially when you're trained as a teacher you stand in the front of the classroom, you are the expert, you're in control of the classroom management, all of those things. And for people who really struggle with relinquishing control, that can be very discomforting. And puts you in a place where you're maybe a little anxious or always second guessing yourself. And so coming into staff meetings that you're leading and we're doing staff development, that's a fun game or something. I think for a lot of us,
music trivia,
but watching, Saturday Night Live clips, but it just all of those things, because you were able to bring it back down and say, okay, here's the connection. Here's why we're doing this, and gave people permission to go, oh, well, I can do that. Or if they still were like, I'm really struggling. And especially in the last few years where you and Mickey would say, okay, hey, you just come sit with us and we'll go through this inquiry block together and start brainstorming ideas. And sometimes I would get to be able to do that as well with other teachers. And I'm like, I love this. I'm going to fire hose everything at you. So if you need me to slow down, tell me to do so, because I'm just going to start riffing. And I know that can be overwhelming, but just having the permission to say, I don't know how to do this right now, and knowing someone would be there to help you.
Yeah, I think it takes, just like the kids don't always trust right away that like, are you really never going to give me a grade? Or you say that you're not going to give this, but when is the other shoe going to drop kind of thing? And we take them through that detox, really starting to see that teachers also needed that, because in a lot of our backgrounds and experience, when administrators come in the room, it means something bad, right? When they walk through your classroom, it means something terrible has gone on, or you're under the microscope and you better, everybody better be on their best behavior. I remember a master teacher early in my career tell me, the first week of school, you tell the kids that anytime an administrator walks in, their job is to immediately put on a play. And I kind of laughed, I think, but I have had administrators that was true,
Mm-hmm.
you know, like they wanted to see the song and dance and they didn't ever get to see reality.
Right.
And I've had teachers over the years saying, I can't tell you how nice it was that I was laying on the floor next to a student and we were playing a game and I didn't immediately feel like I needed to get up and like,
Right.
you know, look impressive. And to me, I'm like, that was so impressive. You were seeing a student on the floor learning, you got on their level and you were interacting with them on a human level. Like, that's
Right.
exactly what I want to see. So I think sometimes just the practices that we're used to can put us on guard. And I think it takes teachers time to trust that, you know, we are who we say we are as well. And the other shoe's not going to drop
We talked about
for them
baggage,
either.
baggage that families brought with them and what schooling is. We talked about baggage that students have brought with them of what schooling is and have they learned to play the game of school and whatnot. But a lot of teachers come in with that as well and helping to see that whether it is from a teaching experience or from a learning experience. I think we both said before that, you know, we were both people pleasers and we had both had to get the A or the, you know, the best grades all the time. What kind of baggage did that bring with us? And then there are other teachers who I know they were like, yeah, I was a horrible student. And they are some of the best teachers I've ever met because they know what means, right? To meet the needs of the kids who don't always succeed immediately. So I look at all of those things. And I think, again, if as a teacher, you feel that that it's that trust and building relationships, it's not just teacher to student. It has to be the whole culture of the school. And you can walk into any school building and immediately know what the culture feels like just by, I shouldn't say you can. Not everybody can. If I walk in, I feel a heaviness on my shoulders, right? And I know that this is a place where discipline is the number one issue and learning comes after that. So I'm watching kids walk through a school with, they're all in a perfect straight line. Their hands are behind their back. They're silent. And I'm like, oh, it's that kind of school. Just seeing that one thing that's not
and the teacher is on hyper vigilant alert to make sure everybody's in the straight line and
right. Or others I can see, you know, a kid's wandering through the hallway by herself and nobody's on her case asking where she's going because she's trusted to go to the right place. And that tells me a whole lot about that culture before I even see an adult.
Yeah. That brings us to, so I'll touch on professional development, but maybe we'll do a whole thing on how we did professional development. But a lot of my goal during PD had nothing to do with content, with anything except for remembering what it feels like to be a student for the first time or to be playfully engaging each other. And so we did things for our work week professional development that I'm sure people would look at and think, well, what a waste of time. To me, not a waste of time. And I think we have the evidence to support that it wasn't the waste of time. But things like the year that we went paddleboarding all together as a staff. And the reason that I chose that activity is because as we were talking, we realized none of us had ever been paddleboarding.
I had been once.
And I was like, oh, had you?
And
I was like, well, we should do that as a staff. And my thinking was, this is the part I don't tell people until afterwards, but my thinking was, we're all going to be students for the first time again. Right. We're going to have an experience that we haven't had before. It's going to build empathy for what our students feel like. And so we went up to Evergreen Lake, the most beautiful setting you can imagine. We rented paddle boards. Michelle had been one, so I'm sure that you got up faster than some people. Some of them got up immediately, unafraid to fall in the water or get wet. Like they just did not care. Some of them immediately were paddling across the lake and like engaging in jousting, you know, from the paddle boards. And then we also had staff who, you know, chose to stay seated or on their knees the entire time. And then afterwards we went to Bud's and had a cheeseburger and talked about like, what is that? Sweet Bud's, hole in the wall burger place. What did it feel like to be a student for the first time again, trying something new that you didn't know how it was going to go? And that's all I had to say. And then the stories that came out of, well, I figured I'd just jump in and see how it worked. And then the one who stayed on her knees was like, I just didn't feel like getting wet, and I was a little bit hesitant, and I just, I was just really taking in the beautiful scenery, and I was perfectly happy doing what
Right.
I was doing. But then to put us back in that, what does it feel like to be a learner? How is that going to translate when we see kids who are a little more hesitant to get engaged? It might not be because they're not interested in the activity. It might be because they're focused on something else, like the beauty of the natural setting, right?
Right.
Um, we're going to have some that are immediately going to jump in and then make it a game of who can knock who off the, and all of that happens in a classroom. But to remember that we're dealing with humanity in our classroom, it was always my goal in professional development, is how do we bring it back to remember we have kids that are coming in, some who have done it, some who have never seen it, some who have never experienced anything like this, some who are afraid of water, all of that is
Right.
true in any lesson that we're teaching. And it's so easy to forget that in a classroom setting when our goal is the standard that's written on the board and the lesson that's predetermined. It's really easy to forget that we have all of that in the classroom.
Yeah, it's become like a business model, right? Rather than cultivating and nurturing children into learning. And you texted me last night about the Casa Bonita documentary.
Oh, it's so good.
So we watched it. And
you did?
We did. And one of my favorite things about that whole, if you haven't watched that documentary, highly recommend it. It'll make your heart hurt in some spaces, especially if anything financial.
It's on Paramount Plus.
Yeah. So my favorite part was that Trey Parker, throughout the whole thing, kept saying, we need to remember that this is about the kids. And that the experience,
he's like, what is a 7-year-old going to experience?
The experience is like when the pre-open, he goes, it feels like a nightclub or a bar. I didn't like any of it. And it came back down to, I want kids to walk into a place and feel the magic instantly and be, look at everything with wonder, and they're going to learn something in this area, and they're going to go play over in this area, and they're going to run around, and everything's going to be okay for them. And I feel the same way about school. We have to remember that these are little people, even if they're 18 years old and taller than we are, they still have minds that are not fully developed yet. And their minds are just as important as their hearts, or I should maybe flip that around. Who they are is just as important about what they're going to learn. And if I'm really doing my job, I have to care about all of that child and not just what they can spit back out at me at the end of the week. And so I'm, up and down about how I feel about South Park sometimes, but I was like, yes, Trey Parker, that is exactly what we should be remembering.
We need a professional development. When we reopen, our professional development is going to be Casa Bonita, followed or preceded, I don't know which yet, by the documentary altogether. And it's brilliant. Schools should be Casa Bonita.
Yes. With the renovations already done, not the pre-renovations. Yes. The last time I was there was in 2016,
and preferably without the $40 million.
Right. Oh my gosh, Adam Bello had been there as a youngster, and he wanted to take all of us in 2016 because he was so excited to go back there. And I was like, dude, I've been there. I'm not eating anything. I might eat the sopapillas. And then after you watch the documentary, you're like, oh, I shouldn't have had anything to drink either, but like a soda or whatever, because of all the, But again, that the memories that it had created for Adam as a child, and that's what he was still excited about as an adult in his, I think he was in his 40s then. Now I'm like, okay, what can we learn from that? How did that experience stick with him? Because not only was it fun, but there was memory with his family. And so I'm like, okay, we can do these things in school. It doesn't have to be, I think there's some misconception of learning has to be hard and you have to suffer through it. And I don't think you have to suffer it. It can be hard. Yes. And the word that we hate, rigor. Rigor is not a great word. It can be challenging. It can even give us frustration because that's part of learning sometimes too. Sometimes there's something that's frustrating, but if it's painful and it feels like I have to suffer through this, then we're not doing it right. There has to
No,
be
agreed.
some level. And that's again where I go back with inquiry. There were a lot of times my kids came up and they're like so frustrated because they couldn't figure something out. And again, as me as a teacher, my job was to help them not just, oh, here's the answer for you. I'll take this away from you. Was to encourage and say, I know it's frustrating. You're almost there. What else can we try? And asking more questions, getting them in that frame of mind of, yeah, I'm not there yet, but I can still get there.
And the reality is the learning that comes after that moment of frustration is so much richer than if we just give the answer.
Right.
Because it's just that, like, it's got to be a rush of endorphins. Like it just feels so good when you figure it out and you finally make the connection and it's like the light bulb goes off and it's just such a rush, and then that learning's going to stick with you.
Joe Bowler talks about that when there's like 4 points in math that she tries to help kids understand, and that you don't have to be speedy or whatever, but one of them is about the struggle. And she goes into neuroscience and talks about when you struggle with something and then you figure it out, the synapses that are created in the neurons that are all firing in your brain, there's something magical happening. It's not magical, it's science, but there's something that's happening there that
feels
really
magical.
strengthens what you've learned. It totally does. But for some people and for others, it doesn't. It feels difficult. But I love that. That's one of the points that she brings up to say, you're not the only one who struggles to learn sometimes. And it's actually good for your brain if you're making mistakes, if you're struggling with something, and then you figure it out.
Yeah. The struggle for me was more of the suffering in school, right? It was I can't memorize this thing well enough, or it's too hard. I don't really understand even what it's doing. And I'm just trying to memorize the formula or whatever it might be. And there's this great experiment called the Lawrence experiment, where they looked at students who were A students, passed a test. I think it was a B average the first time they passed it, took the exact same test 3-4 weeks later, and it was a D average in the class. And it's like,
right. Was
anything actually learned? Well, no, because they were doing the same thing I was. The learning was for the test. As soon as the test is over, you clear the cache. It wasn't about the learning. It was about the end result. And as soon as that test happened, the learning ended, or in some ways it never was learned to begin with, I would argue. And so it's just gone.
Just very surface level learning, like baby memorizing something in a certain way. And that's why, like, when you look at math problems, if you take an addition problem, for example, and instead of saying 4 + 8 = 12, you say 4 + blank = 12. That's harder for kids to do than 4 + 8 = blank, because you've changed the way that they've memorized it. So it's not really understanding the concept. It is, I've memorized how I say it and how it looks. And you and I have talked a lot about how many times adults have come to us, parents, whoever, saying, oh yeah, I'm pretty sure I learned that in high school or middle school or whatever, but I've forgotten it. Like I couldn't tell you anything about that. So, we talk about learning and how there's a lot of things that go into short-term memory and into long-term memory. And there are people who can pull things that they've had stored in long-term memory. They can practice a little bit. And then it's like, okay, yeah, I didn't forget this. I just had to refresh my memory a bit. And now I know how to do this. So that is actual learning. If it's just that surface level where we really never get to do anything with it and we just file it away, it's going to disappear. So I feel like there are a lot of things where in traditional schooling, we deal with surface level learning only, and then we move on. And where we have inquiry blocks that naturally feed into each other. So if we start off with who we are and who we are in place and time, well, our identity going into, well, how do we fit into our society or our culture, or what did it look like 100 years ago? All of those things really start to like stair step into or scaffold into learning that the kids can build upon. So when we look at inquiry in that shape and form, it's really helping kids add layers to their levels of knowledge, and not just, okay, we put that away, we're going to ignore it, now we're moving on to something brand new.
Yeah. I love the way that our inquiry blocks, I think this is a feature. It's not my brilliance so much as the IB PYP questions. They really are so brilliant in the way that one naturally kind of feeds into the next, naturally feeds into the next. And then the next year, you're doing all the same inquiry blocks. That's how we do it. We do all the same inquiry blocks. The lines of inquiry will have changed, but the actual who we are, where we are in place and time, how we express ourselves, those all stay the same.
Right.
It's incredible to see how it just keeps spiraling and connecting. I mean, it's more like a web almost than a spiral, that it just keeps connecting from year to year and from block to block. That it's never like, well, that's over. We don't have to think about it anymore. We're not thinking about it. We're constantly like pulling back those pieces and reconnecting those pieces because of the way the blocks are structured.
Well, and that web is a great metaphor, because when you look at the center of the web, if that is your main idea, and how maybe you're just weaving the next few sections of the web, but as time goes on, that web keeps getting bigger and bigger. And now look at all the branches that are coming out of that into that one main idea. And I know that that's a lot of times when we would use a web as a template for kids to start thinking about, well, what could possibly be connected to this question that we have as our inquiry statement, and what lens are we looking through to focus our research here today. And
that's how I create the inquiry blocks. Is really, it starts as a web for me, like literally on paper every summer. It starts as a web, and how could this connect in, and where does this connect? And sometimes, teachers looking at it for the first time are like, I don't know what your brain was doing that you made a connection between these two things. And it was like, oh, I watched the Casa Bonita documentary, and that's how it's like these random moments that all come back and connect back. But I love that. How did you like to start an inquiry block, being that you didn't start, I didn't give you, here's how you're going to start this next inquiry block. It was really, you had kind of the theme, the line of inquiry, the lens that you were looking through, variety of questions that went along with that line of inquiry that I associated with it. So you weren't just starting at nothing. But how did you like to start inquiry blocks with kids?
It really depended on the group of kids that I had. And that's, but we've been saying that over and over throughout all of our episodes, right?
Still true.
It's absolutely true. And I had learned to do inquiry with provocations. So find something to hook the kids' interest that's going to help generate questions. Sometimes it was a question, maybe that was, or a statement. One year we did a whole inquiry unit on different types of governments, because the how we organize our self block, which was our block 5, talked about that, people choose to organize themselves in some form of government, and governing, I shouldn't say government. And the kids had lots of questions for that. So that year it was literally a statement. Other kids, it might've been a video or a science experiment or a song, or we'd take a trip. I mean, it could be anything. Yeah, that was a provocation. Then I would ask them to generate the questions. Sometimes we would put sticky notes up on chart paper or around the room. Other times, if I had kids who weren't writing yet, I would ask them to give me their questions and their thoughts, and then I would write it for them. And as the year progressed and they were writing more, they would start drawing pictures and for their own questions. So it really was back down to, was I doing open inquiry or structured inquiry? And in the early years, it was a lot more structured. So I was one helping them to realize here's each different stage of an inquiry process. And even as time went on, that the stages of the inquiry process didn't always look the same, because it depended on the kids. Some of those kids were so independent, they could just go with it. And I just sat back and helped be the resource. But it was always so fascinating because they would always come up with questions that you hadn't thought of, always.
Yeah, I like doing the star bursting with them because so essentially you have a star and it's got the who, what, where, why, when, how questions around it. And their job is to, whatever the topic is, come up with as many what questions as they can, as many how questions. It just gets them, when they have to focus in on a specific kind of questioning, it gets them asking more interesting questions than they might naturally.
Right. And like, what questions haven't we asked yet that might include a how or a why or something like that? And they, again, depending upon the group of kids, some of them, I remember there were a couple of years where they just couldn't figure out a question because they were looking, they were too busy looking for answers. So we spent, I thought, okay, well, we need to let's play the question game, and you're going to have a conversation with your partner that I'm going to assign. And you can only have the conversation with questions, and it can't just be a why question, or you have to like, so how is your day today? And you can't just repeat it back to me. You have to say,
why are you asking me how my day is?
Do you think I'm concerned about who you are as a person?
Why would you be concerned with who I am as a person?
See, but we couldn't do that because that was repeating the question. So anyway, that might just be one way to get them thinking on a different level of what questions can look like. So we do that as an experiment. And then we would go back to, okay, which questions haven't we asked yet about this topic? What things might we be curious about? And if you're not curious, pretend you're trying to read my mind. What am I curious about? Because sometimes they're like, well, I don't really care about, whatever this topic is. And
right. Or how would if an alien landed in our classroom,
right?
What questions might they have about this thing that seems obvious to us that might not be obvious?
If I had to write a song about this, what kind of things would I include in that song? I mean, you could reach all the different kinds of kids if you knew them well enough to know what their interests were, what really got them going, what was a spark for them. That's harder to do when you don't know your kids.
Yeah, for sure. I think next week, Michelle, we should talk about service learning, because I've wanted to pull it in to this discussion and field trips and service learning and what that looked like at Anastasis and kind of the importance we placed on it. But it always, those two events always bled into inquiry in the most unexpected and beautiful ways. And so I think maybe that should be our next topic.
Absolutely. I think at some point too, we can talk a little bit more about how we structured things with, some students had been they came to us already very good at the game of school, and going into a school where there's more freedom can be overwhelming.
It's so hard.
Yeah. For somebody who likes a lot of hard deadlines and dates and tell me what you want and tell me when you want it. Right. That was very difficult for a lot of those kids.
It was the what you want and when you want it that was the hardest, for sure. And we had dates that things were due or that we were, block would end. Like we had things that they were aiming for, but it was really hard for the kids who were so used to the teacher assigning the same thing to the entire class, and the outcome being the outcome that's expected is the same for everyone.
Right.
And when that's not the case,
no,
that was really hard.
And even just helping kids learn how to, okay, you like structure. Here's how you can build it for yourself. You like the freedom of not having a lot of structure. Great. Go for it. Show me how you're going to be accountable throughout the process. Because again, on the outside, inquiry can look like so much freedom to people who are not used to seeing that it looks like, well, it's just not very challenging, or you don't care what the kids do and they get to do whatever they want. And that truly is not the case. It takes a lot of self-discipline to be an open inquiry, for sure. But even within guided and structured inquiry, helping kids along. Okay, you said that these are the things that you need to look for. How are you going to make that happen? What timetable are you going to build for yourself? Or do you just want to do it all at once tomorrow and then move on to the next thing? Those can be disconcerting for teachers who are not used to that. Most especially to parents who are used to having teachers dictate every second of the day for a child, or, even every hour. What that looks like when you're talking to parents, I think that we probably will spend a little bit more time in future episodes exploring that as well.
Well, and I think that's an important point, because what you just said was we were teaching kids life skills in that freedom.
Right.
We were teaching them skills that are going to serve them all their lives, of how to make a plan, how to do, how to identify what your aim is and what your goal is when somebody's not defining that for you. All of those things are such important life skills.
Right.
I think we're so used to schools defining all of that and calling it education, and we do kids such a disservice because they don't, when we're always the one doing that on their behalf, there's never the opportunity for them to really discover what does work for me.
I read an article that compared kids leaving the school environment, whether they're going into post-secondary or into some kind of a job situation. Mm-hmm. They made the comparison to people leaving prison.
Wow.
And they don't know what to do with freedom when someone isn't controlling their actions for 8 hours a day or 24/7, whatever.
That is fascinating and spot on.
I need to see if I can find that article again. I read it a while ago, but it was very much you'll see a lot of people have some life struggles and even some very internal issues, mm-hmm. because they no longer have someone telling them what to do every second of the day. Now they don't know what to do because they were never given enough freedom to ease into that. And it's why a lot of kids,
and they were never taught how to properly manage that freedom.
Right. A lot of kids who go to college and they're away from their families for their very first time, and they get into some trouble, whether that's emotional or physical or lots of different issues, because mm-hmm. they've never had the freedom of just doing whatever they wanted. And how to self-discipline and integrity and just knowing what's best for yourself. I mean, I know my freshman year in college, I would go back and do things differently because I was like, wow.
1,000%.
Yeah. So it's not that we all need to go through our freshman year of college or our first year, or a gap year away from high school and just let our freak flags fly. It's not all about that.
Right.
It's more about, do I know who I am enough that I can respect myself and do what I know needs to get done? Mm-hmm. I mean, without going into too many details of just problems that people go through, but I think that's something that we were able to do consistently for a lot of kids, was to help them learn to manage their freedoms. Do you need an adult to tell you what to do? Or do you know what to do for yourself that's best for you right now?
Yeah, you're very good at that prompting in any kind of conflict on the playground. Like you were the one who would step in and say, do you need me to solve this for you right now? Or can you solve it? You might not like how I solve it. It might go better. I'm happy to help. I'm here if you need me, but do you need me to solve this, or is this something you can solve? And in learning as well. But again, most places prison is not a bad analogy, actually.
It's so sad though, right?
It's really sad.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's talk service and field trips next week. And thanks for anybody who listened any of these episodes. It's very kind of you to give us attention.
We are grateful for you.
We're grateful for you. Okay. Good to talk today, and onward.
Onward.
Hey, Michelle, where else can people find you online?
I blog at avenue4learning.com, and the 4 is the actual number 4, not the word 4, avenue4learning.com.
And you can find me at dreamsofeducation.wordpress.com, which is my original blog. You can also find me at ktsplace.com, which is where I share a bunch of resources and kind of projects that we're currently working on. And we are both on Blue Sky at the moment, but not as active as we once were on our favorite bird. Come find us and connect with us in other places, and we look forward to connecting with you.